Hello, I'm Monica Hannon. Neuroscience is hot right now because there are few things in life more fascinating than the human brain. And today we're going to be talking with Dr. Ken Larson about some of the ways that the brain works. What makes us tick? You know, the brain is such a complicated thing. Can you start out by just telling us, the structures of the brain? We don't really even understand what all is involved in the brain, right?
That's a good place to start. I think that it would be useful to insert a video here by Dr. Siegel. He has a clever way to explain the brain using his hand. Let's take a look.
One of the most rewarding experiences for me has been to study brain science and apply it to the experience of parenting. And the hand model of the brain that I use to teach parents is very useful to understand that. So if you take your thumb and put it in the middle of your palm, put your fingers over the top, this is a very useful model of the brain. And when we can actually see in front of us what's going on in the brain, then we can change what the brain does. So let me walk you through very basically what happens in this brain and the structures in it. And it goes like this. The spinal cord comes up representing the wrist, and then you have coming up into the skull the brain stem and the limbic area, which work together to help regulate arousal and your emotions and the way you have a fight, flight, freeze response. These are below the cortex, the limbic and brainstem areas, and the cortex is this higher part of the brain that allows us to perceive the outside world, to think and reason. And this frontmost part of the brain, right behind your forehead, so the person's oriented like this, is actually the part that regulates the subcortical, limbic, and brainstem areas.
I find that model very helpful to remember the different brain modules, so to speak, and how they function in our lives.
So are we looking at evolution here? I mean, from the primitive all the way up to the more complex?
Good observation. The brainstem, the most primitive brain module, is often referred to as the reptilian brain, suggesting that this part of the brain resides in animals all the way down to lizards and snakes. The midbrain, or the limbic regions, appear in mammals and begin the development of emotion and the ways that emotions affect behavior. The neocortex can be called the new brain because it appears to be the last module added. This layer manages our thinking and choosing functions, sometimes described as executive functions. This is a very brief and simple overview. There is much more that is known and available for further study for those who are interested.
How does information get into the brain?
Primarily through our senses. Sight, touch, hearing, smelling, tasting. These are the ways that we gather information from outside ourselves and bring it inside so we can process it.
Well, there's a common belief that perception is reality. I know that's something that we hear a lot in the news business and in the news world. Would you say that that's true?
That's a nice philosophical question, which really boils down to how we define reality. Let me inject an image here that I think is important in any discussion such as this. Think of an old-fashioned mechanical slot machine. You can see a row of 3 images. You know that each image is just one small part of a larger wheel that holds many images. Only one image shows at a time. And if they are the right ones, you win a prize. The point here is that we are restricted to seeing only one image out of many. Our perceptions are like that. The information we take in from outside is limited to what we can see and experience with our senses. This is also true of this discussion. We are describing just one glimpse into how we relate to reality. This is not the only way to look at these things, but it is a way that I have found insightful and helpful. In the chart, we talk about the real world, which is all that exists whether we experience or not. As we described earlier, we experience the real world through our senses, which are then shaped by our experience, our learning, and our beliefs. These are represented in the total knowledge filter and the values filter. So what results is, from this sensory data, is our perception of what is outside of us. The tricky part is that this internal perceived world is more real to us than the real world, simply because that is the only way we know the real world. For example, I'm colorblind, and my kids used to ask me what it was like to be colorblind. I could only answer that I have not seen the world through any other eyes but my own, so all I know is the world as I see it. So in that sense, my perceptions are the reality that I use to guide me through life. The interesting part of this is that my perception may well be different from yours, which makes it a challenge to agree on what is reality.
Well, you know, we had talked earlier about how the brain works, and you had shown me a chart, very interesting, about the real world versus the perceived world. How does that compare those for me?
This is where we get into the fun stuff. Thinking people have long looked at the differences between sensations and perceptions. I think the choice theory chart is probably one of the best graphical metaphors I've seen to help us understand the process of going from gathering information through our senses and then processing that information so it becomes useful to us in our brain. So looking at the chart, we can see how the so-called real world exists out there. It exists whether we know it is there or not. Our sensory system contacts this real world and brings in information that is represented in the perceived world as some sort of symbolic representation of what the senses pick up. In other words, if I see a tree, that tree does not move into my brain. It's still outside, but I've formed something in my perceived world that represents that tree so I can think about it and talk about it and recognize it when I see it again. Notice on the chart how sensory information passes through the total knowledge filter, which enables me to recognize the tree because I've learned earlier about trees. The values filter then sort of gives a priority or level of importance to what I see as a tree. This values filter is attuned to my basic needs. If I'm skiing and see the tree, I'm going to give it a high value because I don't want to hit it. And this is driven by my basic need for survival. If I'm driving through a forest, I'm going to put a lesser value on seeing trees because they're just part of the background and have no direct effect on my basic needs at that time.